Hi everyone, looks like we have a lot of people joined, so we're going to go ahead and get the webinar started. I hope that you're all doing well today, and thank you so much for taking the time to join our webinar. With everything going on in the digital marketing industry lately, we're so glad you joined us to talk about CJ's new cookieless tracking solution. Just a couple of quick introductions before we get started. My name is Austin Pardo, and I oversee many of our self-service clients here at CJ. I really hope you'll find today's webinar useful and that you'll take a moment at the end to share your thoughts on what you liked and other topics that you would like to see as webinars in the future. Marissa Moorhead will be our presenter today. Marissa is a senior product marketing manager, and she's been with CJ for over 6 years. In her role, she keeps up with all the latest industry trends and knows our cookieless tracking solution inside and out. Before I turn it over to Marissa, let's speak for a moment about the webinar format. Marissa will be presenting for about 30 minutes, and then we will have time for your questions. Besides the presenters, all attendees will be muted. As you have them, you can send your questions to me in the GoToWebinar software, and I'll get them to Marissa for Q&A at the end of the session. If we don't get to your questions, or if it's something that's more account specific, we'll try to get back to you after the session today. As I mentioned, there will be a post-webinar survey that should be launched within the GoToWebinar interface. We would be grateful for your feedback, and it shouldn't take you more than a few minutes to complete. Finally, we are recording the webinar, and we'll let you know how to access this in a follow-up email. So now it's time to get started with the webinar. Here's Marissa.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Austin, for that flattering introduction. I'm very excited to introduce everybody to CJ's cookieless tracking solution today, and I hope everybody is just as excited as I am and doing well. We will cover today why cookieless tracking is so important in today's digital ecosystem, the challenges our solution helps solve for in the marketplace, how it all works, and of course, next steps and how you will all be able to get started. So with that, I'll give you a brief introduction of who I am, so you know who you'll be listening to for the next half hour or so. Like Austin mentioned, my name is Marissa Moorhead. That's me. I'm a senior product marketing manager. Been at CJ for over 6 years in various roles, including on the publisher development team, managing strategic programs for advertisers, and in product marketing for the last few years. I live in Santa Barbara, California, and yes, I do feel very lucky to live in such a beautiful place. I hope to see some of you later on in September at CJU. And last thing about me before we jump in is I love to travel. I like to take on new exciting things and visit a new place every year. So without further ado, I'd like to present the shifting consumer landscape. So this industry is always shifting, always changing, and that's what makes it so exciting to be a part of this space. Technology is constantly evolving, and part of this evolution of tracking means that cookies can't be relied upon as the sole tracking method going forward. There is a need for additional tracking coverage, and we'll talk about why as the presentation progresses. We're seeing extreme growth in consumer sensitivity around tracking and collection of personal data. In the EU, the GDPR went into effect this May, as a result of well-publicized data breaches. And what we're seeing here is additional growth of this type of legislation. So fundamentally, consumers are becoming more aware of the methods of data collection and would like more and more control over who has access to their data and what they're doing with that data. We'll talk about this a little bit more in just a moment as well. Last, but certainly not least, of this shifting consumer landscape are the consumer behaviors and purchase journeys that are not cookie compatible. And we'll talk about that in just a moment as well. But something to note, these consumer trends are not going to stop with what exists today, and we're going to see this type of behavior and type of industry sentiment continue to grow. So I'm going to walk you through a few key areas where cookies are no longer compatible with tracking in the affiliate space. So the growing challenges with cookies, I like to call this the cookie conundrum. So the 3 important scenarios impacting tracking with cookies today, starting with Apple ITP. 2.0 was just announced earlier this month, and I'll go into more details in just a moment about the new update and the impact to tracking. We'll take a look at privacy and specifically how the GDPR has reshaped the landscape of privacy and tracking within the digital ecosystem. And then I'll touch on transactions that take place in a mobile app and the requirements for a solution that doesn't rely on tracking cookies. So starting with Apple ITP 1.0. ITP stands for Intelligent Tracking Prevention. This is a feature of Apple's Safari 11 browser and iOS 11 operating system and is enabled by default on these operating systems and browsers. This was initially rolled out in September of 2017. The intent behind this feature is to restrict the reading of cookies on a consumer's device if the cookie is being used to track users across websites. So the first version of this feature prevented companies like CJ from reading our own tracking cookies after an initial 24-hour window. So this feature impacts any company or vendor that will need to read a first-party cookie in a third-party context, which is how tracking cookies behave. So the impact here is CJ isn't able to read our tracking cookie at the time of a transaction. That transaction will not track. Apple ITP 2.0 updates. As I mentioned, this was announced earlier this month and will be part of iOS 12 and Mac OS Mojave. These are in beta now. Broad rollout timeline is relatively unknown, but Apple tends to push out these type of updates in the fall. So keep in mind, everything I'm about to share is also going to be enabled by default on consumers' browser. So one of the most critical updates to be aware of during this update is Apple ITP 2.0 removed the ability to read cookies within the initial 24-hour tracking window. This means that once the updates have been completely rolled out, tracking cookies will not be able to be read on Safari browsers at any point. There are additional features that ITP 2.0 released. These are called tracker collusion protection and origin-only refer. So tracker collusion protection, a feature that Apple describes as basically what it sounds like, protection against tracker collusion, recognizes when tracking redirects are used for tracking purposes only and will prevent cookies from being dropped or read in those redirects. So this impacts CJ tracking as well, as we won't be able to read a cookie at any point on a Safari browser, nor will we be able to drop a cookie at any point on a Safari browser. Origin-only refer impacts referring URLs in reporting. What this means is a referring URL may be truncated or shortened. So for an example, if the referring URL is publisher.com/socks, this feature of Apple ITP 2.0 will remove any information after the .com. So it would be publisher.com, you'd be missing the socks. So I'm sure many of you are thinking, what is the potential impact to my program? Well, something I'd like to state, this update is critical and it reflects the climate of the digital ecosystem. What we don't know is if additional browsers or operating systems are going to adopt similar functionality in the future. So it's important to get in front of these type of updates before they become more impactful to the affiliate space. So what is the potential impact, you ask? On average, programs on CJ see about 27% of transactions take place on a Safari browser. So a key point to make here is that this information is also available and visible to publishers. And they're very, very sensitive to the fact that they may, in the very near future, limit the amount of transactions they're able to be commissioned on for the value that they drive. So it's expected that many publishers may shift some focus toward advertisers that are tracking these transactions and compensating publishers for the value and the sales that they drive. So In short, to sum up, Apple ITP 2.0 will pose a significant risk to tracking integrity and will create data loss concerns. So that 27% on average, once ITP is fully in effect, will become untrackable without an alternate tracking solution in place. I touched on privacy and the climate that has been generated under the concern about reading or writing data to a consumer's device. But just a reminder, EU consumer consent is needed in order to write or read data to a consumer's device under the GDPR or the General Data Protection Regulation. This was a loud signal to the market that privacy is going to be a continuing concern. So much so that we're not seeing any of this slow down. It's coming stateside already in my home state of California. And for anybody that is following this closely, like many of you I'm sure are, there is an act called the California Consumer Privacy Act, eligible for the November ballot or potentially sooner if the legislation is passed this week. And this bill's intention is to provide consumers with the right to know what data companies are collecting about them and the ability to request that that data be deleted should they choose to do so. So in-app tracking transactions that take place within a mobile app. Mobile apps behave differently than the mobile web. Mobile apps don't rely on standard tracking cookies in order to track in-app activity. So cookies can't be used to associate a click with an in-app transaction. And the reason for this is that mobile apps don't share information like cookies with the device's mobile browser. So put in other words, if a click occurs in one environment, like the mobile web on a publisher's mobile website, and the transaction occurs in an advertiser's app, cookies can't be used to tie these two events together in order to properly track. One thing to call out here, in scenarios where consumers start their shopping journey in a publisher's mobile app and complete their purchase on a mobile website, standard tracking cookies will still apply. So this in-app tracking component is only speaking to transactions that take place within an app. So times are changing, and it's important to find the right balance. It's crucial to understand consumer sensitivity and technology like Apple's ITP 2.0 feature that are going to restrict the use of tracking cookies. That said, marketing is going to continue to become more data-driven, and data is required to make actionable and authentic decisions to run programs more efficiently and effectively. Well, the great news, we've got you covered. So fundamentally, our goal is to make sure that we are able to provide you with technology and data to set your program up for growth and long-term success. We are invested in future-proofing our clients for the long haul and inevitably bridging the gap between tracking cookies, tracking integrity, and individuals. All right, so now on to the good stuff. So I'm pleased to tell you about our cookieless tracking solution and how this solution combats these cookie challenges I just talked about. Very briefly, just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of tracking aligning with the customer journey, I'll do a very quick recap of CJ's cookie-based tracking. All right, so now we have a consumer and a consumer journey. So first, a consumer clicks on a link on a publisher's website, within a publisher's mobile app, in a publisher's newsletter or email, or any place a publisher can put a tracking link, for example. After this click, a CJ cookie is dropped on the consumer's browser after they are navigated through a CJ tracking server. The consumer is seamlessly directed to the advertiser's website and completes their purchase. At this time, the CJ conversion tag or confirmation pixel notifying CJ of a transaction fires to process order details. And finally, we leverage our cookie to associate the click to the transaction in order to properly track, report, and commission the publisher that referred this transaction. What we will see here is without this cookie being present, unreadable, or being deleted, we're not able to do this cookie-based correlation. And ta-da, our cookieless tracking solution. So we've developed a new, very simple parameter called the CJ event ID that allows CJ to retain tracking even when a tracking cookie isn't present or we're not able to read this cookie. So this event ID acts like a key or a lookup for a click and referenced when a transaction takes place. Each event ID is unique to a specific and individual click. So once this is enabled for your account, CJ will pass the unique event ID on a click, and you will store this ID on your website, just like any other URL parameter that you might be using for analytics purposes, like referring channel. When a transaction takes place, this same ID is sent back to CJ in your confirmation pixel call, and we do the rest. We will find the click associated with that unique event ID in order to properly track the transaction. So one thing I would like to note is if there is a cookie present, we will still leverage the cookie in order to track. So cookieless tracking is a necessary supplement to cookie-based tracking, but doesn't replace cookie-based tracking. So the event ID is applicable in moments where we're not able to read our cookies, which wouldn't be possible under Safari browsing restrictions with Apple ITP 2.0 or declined consent in the EU under the GDPR. So let's take a quick look at the CJ's cookieless tracking journey. The consumer is still going to click on a link placed anywhere a publisher is able to place tracking links. They are redirected through our server, and at this time, we create the unique event ID and pass this to you upon the click. Unless we're unable to do so, we will still drop a cookie at this time. Once the transaction takes place, you will pass the same event ID back to CJ in the pixel call, and we will use this event ID in order to find the click, to understand which publisher to commission, and to report the transaction. So there's no gap in data once this is enabled. Diving in a little closer to CJ's event ID. So again, a proprietary identifier created at the time of the click, acting as a reference for information associated with the click. The kinds of things that we capture with the event ID are the AID, also known as the ad ID or link ID, PID, so we understand the referring publisher, SID, or the publisher's shopper ID, if this is something that's included, and the click time and date stamp. In terms of privacy, the event ID does not capture any data that is unique to an individual or considered sensitive, such as IP address. There's no way to associate the event ID back to any individual, only the individual click. And because we capture all of these pertinent data points to track and properly commission publishers, the CJ Event ID solution abides by all program term policies. We're able to see the click time and date stamp to understand if the transaction took place within the referral period. We know the publisher, so we know which publisher should be commissioned and at which rate. And additionally, we know the link and the link ID value, so this will all be included in reporting. So a brief overview of all of the value points that I just discussed, but in short, CJ's cookieless tracking solution allows for seamless tracking when a CJ cookie isn't present. One thing I would like to make sure is very clear, and we're very proud, this is a very simple enhancement to existing Pixel integrations. We have clients who have said that this takes a matter of minutes in order to implement. So it's not heavy lifting in terms of an integration update. This solution solves for Apple ITP 2.0 cookie restrictions. I mentioned it's privacy and GDPR compatible. We're not reading or writing any information to a consumer's device, nor capturing any information a consumer would consider sensitive or personal, but rather associating a click a consumer made with the purchase that they made via the event ID. This solution will enable advertisers to track in-app transactions. So if you have a mobile app, this solution can work for you. Most apps can support capturing and storing URL parameters, which will include the CJ event ID. So similarly to the standard web transactions, you will pass the CJ event ID back to CJ, and we will do the association to the initial click. No cookies required. This solution solves for cookie loss tracking issues and will result in fewer missing order reports. The idea here is that if a user deleted their cookies and you have OIM inquiries about missing orders, this solution will solve for that fact because we don't need a cookie in order to track that transaction. And finally, this solution abides by all program term settings, including referral period. So we know the time of the click, we'll know the time of the transaction. If that transaction took place within referral period set in program terms for that specific publisher, we will ensure that the transaction is tracked. Alternately, if the click took place outside of referral period terms, we won't track the transaction. And as a final thought, I will leave you with the value of the complete picture. Competitive, efficient growth. So transparency. In order to maximize the value of your efforts, you have to be able to see the complete picture and minimize the risk of tracking and data loss. Efficiency. Simplify your integration to reduce missing orders so you can be more efficient with managing your partnerships and managing your time. And ultimately, a comprehensive integration will help you recognize smart growth. All right, so next steps. Hopefully you're excited as I am about cookieless tracking, and to let everybody know, this is available today at no cost and is a simple integration enhancement. To get started, you can reach out to your CJ team or submit a case through our support center. The case reason will be advertiser tracking, and the sub-reason will be cookieless tracking requests. And finally, please join us on July 18th to learn more about leveraging our cross-device solution to drive strategic program growth. Now, Austin will be putting a link to register to this webinar in the chat for anybody who's interested and hasn't done so already. And with that, I will open this up to some Q&A.
All right, thank you, Marissa. That's some great information. We have quite a few questions that have come in already, so we'll try to get through as many as time permits for us here today. And a reminder, if you have any questions, go ahead and submit them through the little questions panel in the GoToWebinar software. So kind of going back, Marissa, to the beginning of your presentation, talking about Apple ITP, the question is this included Safari on mobile as well as desktop?
Sure, great question. And the answer is it's both desktop and mobile. So Safari browsers on desktop are impacted and will be impacted, as will Safari browsers on iOS devices like iPhones and iPads.
Great, thank you, Marissa. So we kind of have a few questions around the same thing. So I'm going to try to paraphrase everyone's question kind of together. So people are asking about the difference between cookie tracking and cookieless tracking. Do I have to choose between the two, and kind of why have two simultaneously?
Sure, great question. No, in short, I will answer you briefly and then I'll explain why. Do you have to choose? No, you do not. So we know that there are many, many types of shopping journeys that are still cookie compatible. We are seeing an increase in scenarios where a supplement to cookie-based tracking is necessary, but where we still have the opportunity to drop and read our cookies, we will do so. again, it's supplemental. In instances on Safari where we are not going to be able to drop our cookies or read our cookies, a cookieless tracking solution is required. If there's a cookie present, like on a standard journey from desktop tracking, we will rely on our cookie. The nice part about integrating this solution is advertisers don't have to choose between the two. If we are able to identify that a cookie is present, CJ will do the work to read that cookie. If there's no cookie present and an advertiser is integrated to pass us the event ID, we'll use that event ID at the transaction to look up the click associated with that transaction. So the heavy lifting is on our end to determine the right method of tracking, but we know that supplemental tracking is necessary and evolving and growing.
Great, that's a great explanation, Marissa. And we have a few questions around integration and how this works. So there are kind of two questions that I think you can answer at the same time, which is, how do I store this event ID value on my site, and then what updates do I have to make, if any, to my current integration in Pixel?
Sure, good questions. So I'll address the first. How will the event ID be stored on an individual website? Well, each website is set up to function a little bit differently. A few of the methods our clients have been able to leverage who are already integrated is to either store the event ID value in a cookie they're already dropping on consumers' browsers. So remember, these are first-party cookies and not confined to the same restrictions as tracking cookies like CJ. So the concerns I mentioned about Apple ITP don't apply in scenarios where an advertiser is dropping a cookie from their own website on a consumer's browser. Additionally, clients have been able to store the event ID on their backend servers. Something I want to point out, our client integration team is well poised to consult with any clients interested to determine the best approach to address storing the event ID value. And to add to that, if there's any questions or anybody has thoughts about tag managers, our client integration team is also creating tailored documentation for the top tag managers to provide to clients upon request, which outline exactly what they would need to do to capture, store, and pass this value back in their CJ Pixel. So our teams on the integration side are enthusiastic about making sure tracking is current and up to date, and will help tailor any needs after a consultation to figure out exactly the best way to approach capturing, storing, and passing this value.
Great, thank you, Marissa. Another question, is an unconditional CJ pixel required for cookieless tracking?
Sure. That is a good question. So in short, it's not required, but I'd like to point out that it's still considered best practice. So the way this would work, if you do have conditional logic to fire the CJ tag on your website, is you would identify that a transaction should be credited to CJ, and you would populate the event ID at the time that your system chooses to fire the CJ pixel. So one thing to note, like I mentioned, there are still vast benefits to being able to leverage cookies to track where we can, and that brings me to cross-device tracking. I mentioned the webinar coming up next month. I would encourage everybody to attend. But in short, cross-device allows us to associate all cookies and devices with an individual. We can reassociate a device to a user if the user deletes their cookies once a purchase is made, but in instances where we're not able to read a cookie at all, we're not able to do cross-device tracking. And for the most complete view of your program, you would need to provide that visibility into all transactions. So we can determine if there's a cross-device match and a transaction should be credited. And in order to do cross-device, an unconditional integration is required. Something to note here too, the event ID and an unconditional integration are part of our standard integration going forward. So we are considering this to be the most optimal and ideal integration.
Great, thank you, Marissa. one thing that's come up that I think you could shed some light on is you talked about Apple with the ITP updates truncating some of the referring URLs. So the question is, does that affect the event ID that we are passing to advertisers?
Oh, wonderful question. No, fortunately, it does not. So the event ID is passed as an additional parameter and doesn't count toward that origin-only referred update. Neither, basically, let me take this back a step. None of Apple's ITP 2.0 features that they're rolling out are going to be impacted by cookieless tracking. Another way to say that, cookieless tracking and our event ID will solve for each of those individual updates.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to paraphrase a few questions again here. So people are asking if a consumer comes to my site and I store the event ID and they come back later, how does that work if they don't convert the same day?
Sure. So the best way I can answer this without providing specific technical advice, because that's better suited for technical teams to talk to our client integration experts, but oftentimes this is accomplished by the advertiser dropping a cookie, a first-party cookie, on the consumer's browser. And what this means is when they recognize that consumer once again, the event ID value is stored in the cookie that is already present on their browser. And the value of doing this or storing it in a database is that if the consumer doesn't transact immediately, we're still able to capture that transaction. And like I mentioned, the client integration team are prepared to advise on specifics depending on website structure, shopping cart technology, and any tag managers in place.
Awesome, thank you, Marissa. So another question, I think you touched on this at the beginning, but maybe we can elaborate a little bit more is, how do I tell the impact on my program? So maybe looking at, what Safari traffic I'm getting currently.
Oh, great question. Yes, so what I would advise is in order to understand the potential impact, and again, Apple ITP 2.0 is something that is going to be rolling out likely in the fall. Apple's not always very clear about when and how they release updates, only that updates are going to be forthcoming. So if you want to get an idea of how many transactions have taken place in your program on Safari over a given amount of time, just to get a pulse, you can run a transaction report and run commission detail and look at the concluding browser column. So if the browser is Safari, it means that after the new ITP features are fully rolled out, these transactions would be something that wouldn't be tracked without cookieless tracking in place. And again, you'll see revenue, commission, order values, et cetera, associated with these transactions to get a pulse of what the impact could look like for your program. And publishers also have visibility into that data in their commission detail reports as well.
Great, thanks, Marissa. Kind of along the same lines, you just talked about the potential kind of impact of the program. Can you just talk about again, when does ITP 2.0 actually really go into effect, or what do we know so far based on what Apple has told everyone?
Sure, absolutely. So what we know so far is that ITP 2.0 is currently in beta. So there are users that are being exposed to these features today. We don't know what that beta means or how widespread the beta is, but typically Apple rolls out these updates in the fall, sometime in the fall. Again, they're not always very clear about when, but it will be impacted fully on iOS 12 and Mojave operating system on desktop. So when these releases come out in the fall, these features are going to be enabled by default.
Great, thank you, Marissa. I think we'll just do maybe one or two more questions here to respect everyone's time. And we have a number of questions that are more account specific, and we definitely will take those back and get you answers after the session today. So we kind of just talked about timing, Marissa. So a few questions are, can I do this now? And then is there a deadline for me to make this update to implement the cookieless tracking?
Ooh, good questions. You can absolutely do this now. This is available today. There's no cost for it, and it is a very simple integration enhancement. If you would like to get started, I'll just remind everyone, you can reach out to your CJ contact, or you can submit a case in the support center under advertiser tracking, and then the sub-reason is cookieless tracking request. I would absolutely encourage everybody to get started today and take the next steps, get the appropriate documentation, and secure the time. Deadline for this, my thoughts are as such. As soon as these ITP 2.0 features roll out, and as soon as we have a better understanding of things like the California Privacy Act, if that passes this week or becomes part of the November ballot measure, I think this is going to continue to escalate in terms of severe need. As soon as publishers become aware that they're seeing transaction drop off, they're likely to shift their attention to clients who are compensating them for these transactions that otherwise wouldn't be tracked. So deadline-wise, I would say encourage everybody to get started as soon as possible to make sure there's no loss of tracking integrity or data in your program.
Great, thanks, Marissa. And I would just echo that in that we know tech queues can be, long and tough to get into. So we'd recommend, getting in touch with our integration team as soon as you can, and so you can start working with your technical team on getting this in line for your tech queue. And I think that will do it for questions for today. As I said, we have a number that are more account specific, so we'll definitely get you guys answers as soon as we can after the session today and maybe tomorrow once we have a chance to review all of your questions. So thank you all again for attending. A few quick reminders. The recording for this webinar will be sent out to you later today via email. If you have a moment when we close the webinar here, go ahead and please fill out the survey. We really appreciate all your feedback. And join us next month on July 18th for the cross-device webinar. There's a link in the chat right now, so you can go ahead and sign up today. So thank you all so much for attending, and we hope to see you on our next webinar soon. Have a great day.